The autumn air held a crisp bite, the kind that painted the lakeside trees in fiery hues of red, orange, and gold. It was precisely this tranquility that had drawn me, DeAndre Cole, county sheriff, to purchase the secluded cabin on Lake Serenity. After years of serving the community, navigating the complexities of law enforcement, and shouldering the weight of responsibility, I craved a sanctuary. This little haven, far removed from the constant demands of my office, was supposed to be just that, a place to unwind, recharge, and reconnect with the simple pleasures of life. The first weekend I spent there involved little more than setting up the essentials, unpacking a meager collection of fishing gear, and simply sitting on the porch, the gentle lapping of the lake against the shore a soothing balm to my weary soul. I deliberately kept a low profile. No uniform, no official vehicle parked conspicuously in the driveway. It's just me, DeAndre Cole, a regular guy enjoying a weekend away. I even avoided introducing myself to the neighbors immediately, preferring to let things unfold naturally, I envisioned. Friendly waves exchanged across the lawn, maybe a casual conversation about the weather or the best fishing spots. The reality, however, proved to be far different, and it came in the form of Karen. She materialized like a storm cloud on the otherwise clear horizon of my peaceful retreat. Middle-aged, with a permanently pursed expression and a hairstyle that screamed, "I demand to speak to the manager." She carried that infamous live, laugh, love mug like a shield, or perhaps a weapon. Her initial act of welcome, the printed copy of the neighborhood noise regulations slapped onto my porch before I'd even unpacked a single box, was a subtle but unmistakable declaration of war. It wasn't just the act itself, but the timing, the preemptive strike against a potential disturbance. It spoke volumes about her preconceived notions and her penchant for control. I chuckled, chalking it up to overly enthusiastic neighborliness, a quirk of small-town living. I was, after all, the new guy on the block, and perhaps she felt it was her duty to orient me. But the handwritten note that followed a few days later, a thinly veiled accusation of squatting, laced with suspicion and racial undertones, shattered any illusions of innocent neighborly concern. The phrase, "Never seen a man like you," in that house hung in the air like a poisonous fog, its meaning unambiguous. It wasn't just about my presence. It was about my skin color, my perceived place in her meticulously ordered world. This quiet little lakeside neighborhood, it seemed, wasn't as peaceful as I had initially hoped. There was an undercurrent of something else, something darker, simmering beneath the surface. And Karen, with her bleach blonde hair and her live, laugh love mug, was the embodiment of it. I dismissed the note as the ramblings of a bored busybody, a misguided attempt at neighborhood watch gone horribly wrong. Engaging would only validate her behavior, lending credence to her absurd claims. I firmly believed in handling such matters with a cool head and a measured response. Principles I had ingrained in myself throughout my years in law enforcement, so I ignored it, hoping she would eventually run out of steam and find another target for her misplaced anxieties. A big mistake. My next visit to the lake house was met with a full-blown confrontation. As I pulled into the driveway, I immediately noticed the small crowd gathered on my porch, like vultures circling a carcass. There was Karen, of course, standing front and center, radiating an aura of self-righteous indignation. Flanking her were two individuals who could only be described as her eager accomplices. A lanky, slightly unkempt man, introduced as her cousin Randy, and a nervous-looking woman identified as Gail. A neighbor whose eyes darted around as if she were already regretting her involvement. It was like a scene ripped straight from a badly written sitcom, except the laughter was entirely absent, replaced by a palpable tension that made the air thick and heavy. "Where's the rent?" Karen demanded, her voice sharp and accusatory, cutting. Through the quiet of the afternoon, rent, the word hung in the air, absurd and utterly ridiculous. Had I misheard? Is this some kind of bizarre practical joke? I looked from Karen to Randy to Gail, searching for any sign of levity, any indication that this was all an elaborate performance. But their faces were set in a grim determination, their eyes filled with a strange mixture of entitlement and malice. They proceeded to explain their outlandish scheme, a convoluted tale of assumed occupancy, HOA regulations, and a perceived lack of official introduction, according to Karen, since I had not been formally presented at the last HOA meeting, which I hadn't even known existed. And because she had diligently watered the front lawn in my absence, the property was now rightfully hers. Therefore, I owed her back rent for my alleged unauthorized occupation. The sheer audacity of it was breathtaking. I burst out laughing, unable to contain my amusement at the sheer absurdity of their claims. I thought it was a joke, a misguided attempt at humor that had somehow gone terribly wrong. But Karen's expression remained unwavering, her eyes blazing with righteous fury. It was then that I realized this wasn't a joke at all. She genuinely believed her own twisted logic, her own delusional sense of entitlement, as the laughter faded. Replaced by a growing sense of unease, Karen drew her phone, poised to weaponize her delusion. "I'm calling the police," she announced, her voice dripping with self-importance, "to report an intruder refusing to leave my rental property." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. She wasn't just calling the police, she was weaponizing the system, leveraging her perceived authority to harass and intimidate me. It was a calculated move, designed to humiliate me and, ultimately, force me off my own property. I watched as she marched toward her front yard, phone pressed to her ear, her voice rising in theatrical indignation as she spun her web of lies. To the dispatcher. Randy and Gail stood beside her, watching with a mixture of anxiety and anticipation, like stagehands awaiting their cue. I knew I had to remain calm, to avoid escalating the situation further. I walked out to the front yard, hands visible, my demeanor deliberately non-threatening. 10 minutes later, the sirens cut through the serene atmosphere, announcing the arrival of 2 patrol cars. The sight of the flashing lights brought a surge of conflicting emotions. On one hand, I felt a sense of relief that law enforcement had arrived to resolve the situation. On the other hand, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was about to be subjected to a deeply unfair and potentially humiliating experience. The officers emerged from their vehicles, their expressions a mix of curiosity and professional detachment. One of them, a younger officer with a fresh-faced appearance, looked genuinely confused by the scene unfolding before him. The other, a more seasoned veteran, cast a knowing glance at Karen, as if this wasn't the first time he had been summoned to address one of her petty grievances. Karen immediately launched into her tirade, pointing at me with a dramatic flourish, her voice rising in pitch as she rattled off a litany of accusations: freeloading, trespassing, squatting. She demanded my immediate eviction, her eyes filled with a disturbing mixture of entitlement and animosity. The younger officer, clearly overwhelmed by the situation, turned to me and asked for identification. It was the moment of truth, the point at which I had to decide how to proceed. I could have tried to reason with them, to explain the absurdity of Karen's claims, but I knew that words alone wouldn't be enough to overcome her carefully constructed narrative. I reached into my jacket, my hand instinctively gravitating toward the familiar weight of my badge and county ID. I pulled it out, the polished metal glinting in the afternoon sun. The effect was immediate and profound. The scene, a heavy, suffocating silence that seemed to magnify the absurdity of the situation. The younger officer's eyes widened, a look of disbelief spreading across his face. The veteran officer, on the other hand, simply stepped back, as if distancing himself from the impending fallout. I calmly explained, in a voice that was both authoritative and measured, that I was Sheriff DeAndre Cole, the elected sheriff of this very county. I informed them that this was my house, purchased in full 3 months ago, and that the woman standing before them was not only trespassing on my property, but also making a false police report. The silence stretched on, broken only by the chirping of crickets in the nearby trees. Karen stared blankly, her carefully constructed facade beginning to crumble, stammered, attempting to salvage the situation, claiming that there must be a mix-up, that I must be the tenant she spoke to online. But her explanation fell flat, lacking conviction and failing to address the obvious discrepancies in her story. There was no online ad, No prior communication, no legitimate reason for her to believe that I was anything other than the rightful owner of the property. Her attempt to rewrite the narrative only served to further expose the hollowness of her claims. It was clear that she had simply assumed, based on the color of my skin and my perceived lack of introduction to the HOA, that I was an easy target, someone she could intimidate and bully off my own property. She had underestimated me, and she had severely miscalculated the consequences of her actions. But the situation was about to take an even more serious turn. I asked the officers to follow me to the back of the house, where my surveillance camera had captured something far more incriminating than mere trespassing. 2 nights earlier, the camera had recorded Karen attempting to open my back door, using a key of unknown origin. She was wearing gloves and carrying a flashlight, suggesting that her intentions were far from innocent. The recording was irrefutable. Evidence of her criminal activity, transforming the situation from a petty neighborhood dispute into a full-blown investigation. As the officers viewed the footage, their expressions hardened. The seriousness of the situation was now undeniable. Karen's actions had crossed a line, and she was about to face the full weight of the law. This was no longer about a disagreement over rent or HOA regulations. This was about attempted burglary and making false accusations against a law enforcement officer. The atmosphere shifted palpably. The officers, now fully aware of the gravity of the situation, immediately took control. They escorted Karen back to her property, their demeanor professional but firm. There would be no more excuses, no more attempts to manipulate the situation to her advantage. As they led her away, I felt a mixture of relief and satisfaction. Relief that the ordeal was finally coming to an end, and satisfaction that justice was about to be served. I filed a formal statement with the officers, detailing the events of the past few weeks and providing them with a copy of the surveillance footage. I also requested that a formal investigation be opened into Karen's activities. As it turned out, this wasn't the first time she had engaged in such behavior. A few months prior, she had successfully squatted in a deceased neighbor's vacation home, taking advantage of the fact that the property was temporarily unattended. She had managed to live there for several weeks, until the deceased neighbor's family finally arrived to claim the property. However, because the family had lacked concrete evidence, they had been unable to press charges against her. This time, however, things were different. I had video evidence, and I was not going to let her get away with her actions. Within a week, Karen was served with a restraining order, preventing her from contacting me or approaching my property. A formal investigation was opened, and the evidence against her began to mount. Faced with the prospect of criminal charges, Karen finally realized the severity of her situation. 2 months later, she quietly sold her house and vanished from the neighborhood. Leaving behind a trail of resentment and regret, the Live Laugh Love mug, presumably, went with her. As for me, I took steps to ensure that such an incident would not happen again. I installed new, more robust security measures, including additional surveillance cameras and motion-activated floodlights. I also planted a row of thick hedges along the perimeter of my property, creating a physical barrier that would deter any future trespassers. And finally, I was able to enjoy that long-awaited peaceful weekend on the lake. The tranquility of the surroundings finally restored the experience with Karen. While initially frustrating and unsettling, ultimately served as a valuable reminder. It reinforced the importance of vigilance, the need to be aware of one's surroundings, and to take appropriate measures to protect oneself. It also highlighted the insidious nature of prejudice, the way in which preconceived notions and biases can lead to discriminatory behavior and unjust treatment. Karen's actions were driven by a combination of entitlement, arrogance, and racial prejudice. She had assumed, based on my appearance, that I was somehow less deserving of the property, that I lacked the social standing to challenge her authority. Her attempt to intimidate and bully me off my own land was a clear manifestation of her deeply ingrained biases. The incident also underscored the vital role that law enforcement plays in upholding justice and protecting the rights of all citizens, regardless of their race, ethnicity, or background. The officers who responded to Karen's call, once they understood the true nature of the situation, acted with professionalism and integrity, ensuring that justice was served. They did not hesitate to hold Karen accountable for her actions, demonstrating that no one is above the law. As I sat on my porch watching the sun set over the lake, I reflected on the lessons I had learned from the experience. I realized that even in the most idyllic settings, there can be undercurrents of negativity and prejudice. It is our responsibility to confront these forces head-on, to challenge injustice wherever we find it, and to stand up for the rights of all. The moral of the story, as I saw it, was twofold. Don't lie to the cops, especially when you're accusing the sheriff of trespassing on his own property. And never assume someone's status based on the color of their skin or the badge you didn't know they were carrying. The peace of the lake settled around me. The crickets chirped their evening song. I took a deep breath, the crisp autumn air filling my lungs. The ordeal with Karen was over. Justice had been served, and I was finally able to enjoy the serenity of my lakeside retreat.